The rain came down in sheets, a San Francisco deluge that turned the streets into rivers. But inside the townhouse, the air was thick with something heavier than the storm outside. Xavier stood frozen in the marble-tiled bathroom, steam curling around him, his heart pounding as the shadow of a man loomed in the doorway. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. Not with him. At 22, Xavier Martinez was used to navigating life's sharp edges. Growing up in Oakland, he'd learned early how to read a room, how to dodge trouble, and how to keep his heart locked tight. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. Standing half-naked in a stranger's shower, the weight of forbidden desire crashing over him like the waves he'd once surfed on the California coast. It started innocently enough, or so he'd thought. His best friend, Caleb, had invited him over to see his dad's new place. A sleek, modern townhouse in No Valley, all glass and steel and money. Caleb's dad, Adrian Voss, was a 45-year-old architect, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a tailored suit. Xavier had met him a few times before, always a quick handshake, a polite smile, nothing more. But there was something about Adrian's gaze, those steel-gray eyes that lingered just a second too long, that made Xavier's pulse race in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Xav, you got to see this place," Caleb had said, tossing him a beer as they stepped into the house that morning. The living room was a masterpiece of minimalist design, floor-to-ceiling windows, a leather sectional, and abstract art that probably cost more than Xavier's entire college tuition. Caleb was proud, rattling off details about his dad's latest project. But Xavier's attention kept drifting to Adrian, who stood across the room, pouring himself a whiskey despite the early hour. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a jawline that could have been carved from stone. When their eyes met, Adrian's lips curled into a half-smile, and Xavier felt a jolt, like touching a live wire. The tour of the house was a blur. Caleb led him through the kitchen, the study, the rooftop terrace with its view of the bay. Adrian trailed behind, his presence quiet but commanding, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Every so often, Xavier caught him watching, not just looking, but watching, with an intensity that made the air feel electric. By the time they reached the master suite, Caleb's phone buzzed with a work call, and he excused himself, leaving Xavier alone with Adrian in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and leather. "This is the best part," Adrian said, his voice low and smooth, gesturing to the en-suite bathroom. It was a work of art, white marble, a glass-walled shower, and a soaking tub big enough for two. Xavier stepped inside, running his fingers along the cool countertop, trying to focus on anything but the man standing too close behind him. "You should try it out," Adrian added, his tone casual but laced with something darker. "The shower's got great pressure." Xavier laughed, a nervous sound that echoed off the tiles. "Maybe later," he said, turning to leave. But Adrian's hand brushed his arm, just a graze, but enough to stop him cold. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, the air thick with unspoken questions. "I'll show you how it works," Adrian said, stepping past him to turn on the shower. Water roared to life, steam rising in lazy spirals. Xavier's mouth went dry. He should have left, should have followed Caleb downstairs, but his feet stayed rooted to the floor. Adrian turned back, his gaze unreadable but heavy, like he was daring Xavier to make the next move. "I'm good. Thanks," Xavier managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to go, but the storm outside had other plans. A crack of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered, plunging the bathroom into a dim, surreal glow. When the power came back on, Adrian was closer, too close, and Xavier's breath caught as the older man's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "You're soaked from the rain," Adrian said, his voice almost tender. "Why don't you clean up? I'll grab you a towel." It wasn't a question. Before Xavier could protest, Adrian was gone, leaving him alone with the sound of running water and the weight of a choice he wasn't sure he was ready to make. He stripped off his damp shirt, telling himself it was just a shower, just a way to get warm. But as he stepped under the spray, the glass walls fogging around him, he heard the door creak open. His heart slammed against his ribs. Adrian was back, holding a towel, but his eyes weren't on the towel. They were on Xavier, dark and unyielding, like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Mind if I join you?" Adrian asked, his voice calm but charged with intent. He didn't wait for an answer, stepping into the shower fully clothed, the water soaking through his shirt, clinging to the lines of his body. Xavier's mind screamed to move, to say something, but his body betrayed him, leaning into the heat of Adrian's presence, the forbidden pull of something he'd never dared to name. The water cascaded over them, blurring the lines between right and wrong, between friend's dad and something more. Xavier's hands trembled as they hovered near Adrian's chest, the older man's breath warm against his neck. "You've been watching me too," Adrian murmured, his lips brushing Xavier's ear. "Don't pretend you haven't." And in that moment, Xavier didn't. He let the truth crash over him, raw and unfiltered, as their lips met in a kiss that tasted of rain and recklessness. The world outside could wait. This was a storm of their own making, and neither of them was ready to step out of it. The kiss was a spark in a powder keg, igniting something Xavier hadn't known he'd been carrying. Adrian's hands were steady, one cupping the back of Xavier's neck, the other pressed against his lower back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The water pounded against the glass, a rhythmic pulse that matched the frantic beat of Xavier's heart. But all he could feel was the heat of Adrian's skin, the rough scrape of stubble against his jaw. He pulled back, gasping, his mind a tangle of desire and panic. "This is insane," he whispered, water dripping from his lashes. "Caleb's downstairs. He's your son." The words felt like a lifeline, a reminder of the world beyond the steam and the slick marble walls. But Adrian's gaze didn't waver, those gray eyes holding Xavier in place like a tether. "Caleb doesn't need to know," Adrian said, his voice low, almost a growl. He stepped closer, crowding Xavier against the shower wall, the cool tiles a shock against his overheated skin. "This isn't about him. It's about us. About what you want." What did he want? Xavier's life had been a series of careful choices, keeping his head down, staying out of trouble, hiding the parts of himself that didn't fit into the world's neat boxes. He'd come out as gay at 18, but that hadn't made navigating desire any easier, especially not in a city like San Francisco, where every glance could feel like a test. And now, here was Adrian, older, forbidden, and dangerously certain, offering something Xavier hadn't dared to want. "I don't even know you," Xavier said, but his hands betrayed him, resting on Adrian's chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat through the soaked fabric. Adrian's smile was slow, almost predatory, as he leaned in, his lips grazing Xavier's collarbone. "You know enough," Adrian murmured. "You felt it too." The way the air changes when we're in a room together. His fingers traced the curve of Xavier's jaw, gentle but deliberate, like he was mapping every inch of him. "I've seen the way you look at me, Xavier." Don't lie to yourself. The words hit like a punch, because they were true. Xavier had noticed Adrian from the first time they'd met, at Caleb's 21st birthday party a year ago. He chalked it up to admiration. Adrian was successful, charismatic, the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. But there had been moments, fleeting glances, brushes of contact that lingered too long, that made Xavier question whether it was more. And now, standing here, with Adrian's body pressed against his, there was no room left for questions. They kissed again, slower this time, the urgency giving way to something deeper, more dangerous. Xavier's hands found the buttons of Adrian's shirt, fumbling as he undid them, the fabric peeling away to reveal the taut lines of a body that spoke of discipline and care. Adrian's hands were everywhere, his shoulders, his hips, his thighs, claiming him with a confidence that made Xavier's knees weak. But the sound of footsteps downstairs snapped him back to reality. "Adrian," he hissed, pulling away, his chest heaving. "We can't." Not here. The weight of what they were doing crashed over him, betraying Caleb, crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He stepped out of the shower, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around his waist, his skin still tingling from Adrian's touch. Adrian didn't follow immediately. He stood under the spray, water streaming down his face, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said finally, turning off the shower. Not here. He stepped out, dripping onto the marble floor, and grabbed a towel of his own. "But this isn't over, Xavier." "You know that." Xavier didn't respond. Couldn't. He dressed quickly, his damp clothes clinging to his skin, and slipped out of the bathroom before Adrian could say anything else. Downstairs, Caleb was still on his phone, oblivious, talking loudly about a project deadline. Xavier forced a smile, joining him in the living room, but his mind was still upstairs, trapped in the steam and the memory of Adrian's hands. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Caleb suggested grabbing lunch at a nearby cafe, and Xavier went along, nodding at the right moments, laughing when he was supposed to, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adrian, his sharp jaw, his knowing smile, the way his voice had dropped when he'd said, "This isn't over." It was a promise, a threat, a challenge, and Xavier didn't know which scared him more. By the time he got back to his small apartment in the Mission District, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming under the late afternoon sun. He collapsed onto his couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. His heart skipped as he opened it. "Dinner tomorrow. My place. 7 p.m. Don't tell Caleb." It was unsigned, but Xavier didn't need a name to know who it was. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply button, torn between deleting the message and typing yes. The choice felt like a cliff's edge, and he wasn't sure he was ready to jump. Xavier didn't sleep that night. The text from Adrian burned in his mind, each word a hook sinking deeper into his resolve. By morning, his apartment felt too small, the walls closing in as he paced, replaying the shower, the kiss, the weight of Adrian's gaze. He typed and deleted a dozen replies before finally sending one word. Okay. The moment he hit send, a rush of adrenaline flooded his veins, equal parts dread and anticipation. He was stepping into something he couldn't control, and the thrill of it was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. San Francisco was alive that evening, the streets buzzing with the hum of a city that never quite slowed down. Xavier stood outside Adrian's townhouse at 6:55 p.m., his heart hammering as he adjusted the collar of his black button-down shirt. He'd chosen it deliberately, knowing it hugged his frame, accentuating the lean muscles he'd earned from years of surfing and running. If he was going to do this, he wasn't going to play small. Adrian answered the door in a fitted gray sweater and dark jeans, looking every bit the polished architect, but with an edge of something raw beneath the surface. "You came," he said, his voice warm but laced with a challenge, as if he'd half expected Xavier to bail. "Didn't have much choice," Xavier shot back, stepping inside. The house was quieter tonight. No Caleb, no distractions, just the soft hum of jazz from a hidden speaker and the scent of something savory wafting from the kitchen. Adrian led him to the dining room, where a table was set for two, candles flickering against the polished wood. "You cook?" Xavier asked, raising an eyebrow as he took in the spread: grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, a bottle of red wine already breathing. "I'm full of surprises," Adrian said, pouring two glasses with a steady hand. His eyes never left Xavier's, and the air between them crackled, heavy with the memory of the day before. They sat, but the food was almost an afterthought, each bite punctuated by glances that lingered too long, silences that said more than words. Halfway through dinner, Adrian leaned back, swirling his wine. "Tell me about you, Xavier. Not the version Caleb knows. The real you." Xavier hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. "What's there to know? Grew up in Oakland. Got a scholarship to SF State. Studying graphic design. I keep my head down. Stay out of trouble." "That's the surface," Adrian said, his voice low. "I want the parts you don't tell anyone. The parts you're afraid to admit, even to yourself." Xavier's throat tightened. He took a sip of wine, stalling. "Why do you care?" he asked finally, meeting Adrian's gaze. "You're Caleb's dad. You got a life, a career, this house. Why risk it all for whatever this is?" Adrian's smile was slow, almost sad. "Because I've spent too long playing it safe. Building things for other people, houses, careers, expectations." But you leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You make me want to break the rules." The words hit Xavier like a tidal wave, stirring something deep and reckless. He stood, crossing to Adrian's side of the table, and before he could second-guess himself, he kissed him. It was fierce, hungry, a collision of need and defiance. Adrian responded instantly, pulling Xavier onto his lap, their hands tangling as the world outside faded to nothing. They stumbled to the living room, shedding clothes as they went, the urgency of the moment drowning out the voice in Xavier's head screaming that this was wrong. On the leather sectional, with the city lights glittering through the windows, They lost themselves in each other. Every touch a confession. Every kiss a promise. It was reckless. Dangerous. But it felt like the most honest thing Xavier had ever done. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the silence heavy with the weight of what they'd done. Xavier's fingers traced the lines of Adrian's chest, his mind racing. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Adrian's hand stilled on Xavier's back. "We figure out," he said. Together, but the next morning, reality came crashing back. Caleb texted Xavier, asking to hang out, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Xavier stared at the message, guilt twisting in his gut. He'd crossed the line, betrayed his best friend, and yet the thought of seeing Adrian again sent a thrill through him he couldn't ignore. He agreed to meet Caleb for coffee, but as he walked into the cafe, he froze. Caleb wasn't alone. Adrian was there, sitting across from his son, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and Xavier felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about secrets, loyalty, and the price of chasing what you want. Xavier's heart thudded as he stood in the cafe doorway, the smell of espresso mixing with the sharp edge of his panic. Caleb waved him over, all easy smiles, while Adrian sat beside him, his face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing. Xavier forced his legs to move, each step feeling like a march toward a guillotine. "Yo, Zav, you look like you've seen a ghost," Caleb said, laughing as he pushed a chair out. "Rough night." Xavier managed a weak smile, sliding into the seat. Something like that. His eyes flicked to Adrian, who sipped his coffee, his gaze steady but unreadable. The memory of last night, Adrian's hands, his lips, the way they'd unraveled together, burned in Xavier's mind, making it impossible to focus on Caleb's chatter about a new project at work. Adrian's presence was a live wire, electrifying the air. Every so often, his knee brushed Xavier's under the table, a deliberate touch that sent heat racing up his spine. Xavier shifted, trying to focus on Caleb, but the guilt was a weight in his chest, heavy and unrelenting. Caleb was his best friend, the one who'd been there through late-night study sessions, breakups, and the chaos of coming out. And now, Xavier was lying to him, hiding something that could shatter their friendship. "So, what did you think of Dad's place?" Caleb asked, snapping Xavier back to the moment. "Pretty sick, right?" "Yeah," Xavier said, his voice tight. "It's impressive." He risked a glance at Adrian, who raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. Xavier's stomach twisted, caught between desire and dread. "Adrian's been working on that house for years," Caleb continued, oblivious. "He's obsessed with it. Says it's his legacy or whatever." "It's more than that," Adrian said, his voice smooth, his eyes locked on Xavier. "It's about creating something that lasts. Something real." Xavier's throat went dry. He excused himself to the bathroom, needing air, needing space. In a cramped stall, he leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. This was spiraling out of control. He couldn't keep sneaking around with Adrian, not without telling Caleb. But the thought of confessing, of seeing the hurt in Caleb's eyes, made his chest ache. When he returned, Caleb was on his phone, and Adrian was watching him, his expression softer now, almost tender. "You okay?" Adrian asked quietly, leaning in as Caleb typed away. No, Xavier whispered, his voice raw. I can't do this. Not like this. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Then we talk. Tonight. My place. Xavier wanted to argue, to say no, but the pull of Adrian was too strong. He nodded, and the rest of the coffee date passed in a blur. Caleb's laughter a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Xavier. That night, Xavier stood outside Adrian's townhouse again, the city lights casting long shadows across the street. Adrian opened the door before he could knock, pulling him inside with an urgency that matched the day before. But this time, there was no dinner, no pretense. They sat on the couch, the silence heavy between them. We can't keep doing this, Xavier said, his voice breaking. Caleb's my best friend. He trusts me. And you're his dad. This is wrong. Adrian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. I know, he said, his voice low. I've spent my whole life doing the right thing, marrying the right woman, building the right career, being the right father. But this, he looked at Xavier, his eyes raw with emotion. This feels more honest than anything I've ever done. Xavier's heart twisted. He wanted to believe it, wanted to sink into the warmth of Adrian's words. But the cost was too high. What about Caleb, he asked. What happens when he finds out? Because he will. Secrets like this don't stay buried. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I know I can't walk away from you. Not now. The words were a lifeline, but they also felt like a noose. Xavier stood, pacing the room, his hands raking through his hair. I need time, he said. I need to figure out what this means. For me. For us. Adrian nodded, standing to face him. Take all the time you need, he said, his voice soft but firm. But I'm not going anywhere. Xavier left without another word, the cool night air a shock against his skin. He walked the streets of No Valley, his mind a battlefield of guilt and desire. By the time he reached his apartment, he'd made a decision. He couldn't keep lying to Caleb. He had to tell him the truth, no matter the cost. Xavier didn't sleep again, his mind caught in a loop of Adrian's touch and Caleb's trusting smile. By morning, his decision felt less like courage and more like inevitability. He had to tell Caleb, had to face the consequences before the secret tore him apart. He texted Caleb to meet at their usual spot, a small park near the Embarcadero where they'd spent countless afternoons tossing a frisbee or just talking. The bay sparkled under the midday sun, but Xavier felt none of its warmth as he waited. His stomach knotted with dread. Caleb arrived with his usual easy grin, his blonde hair catching the light, oblivious to the bomb Xavier was about to drop. Yo, you look like you're about to puke, Caleb said, tossing his jacket onto a bench. What's up? Xavier opened his mouth, but the words stuck. He'd rehearsed this 100 times in his head. But now, with Caleb standing there, real and solid and so painfully unaware, it felt impossible. I need to tell you something, he said finally, his voice barely steady. It's about your dad. Caleb's brow furrowed, his grin fading. What about him? Xavier took a deep breath, the air sharp in his lungs. Something happened between me and him. At his house, he forced himself to meet Caleb's eyes, watching as confusion gave way to realization. Then to something darker, betrayal. What the hell are you talking about? Caleb's voice was low. Dangerous. What do you mean? Something happened? Xavier's hands shook as he told him, haltingly. Painfully, the shower, the dinner, the nights that followed. He left out the details, the heat of it, but he didn't sugarcoat the truth. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said, his voice breaking. But it did. And I'm sorry. Caleb stared at him, his face pale, his jaw tight. For a moment, Xavier thought he might hit him. Instead, Caleb turned away, his hands clenched into fists. You're my best friend, he said, his voice raw. And he's my dad. How could you do this? I don't know, Xavier admitted, tears stinging his eyes. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. I care about him, Caleb. And I hate that it hurts you. Caleb laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You care about him? He's twice your age. Zav. He's my dad. What the hell is wrong with you? He paced, his anger a living thing, and Xavier felt it like a physical blow. You think this is some romantic bullshit? He's using you. And you're too stupid to see it. The words cut deep. But Xavier didn't argue. He deserved them. Deserved worse. I'm not asking you to understand, he said. I just couldn't keep lying to you. Caleb stopped, his back to Xavier, his shoulders rigid. Get out of my life, he said, his voice cold. I don't want to see you again. Xavier stood frozen as Caleb walked away, the distance between them growing with every step. The park blurred through his tears, the weight of what he'd lost sinking into his bones. He'd known this would happen, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. That night, he went to Adrian's, not because he wanted to, but because he needed answers. Adrian opened the door, his face softening at the sight of Xavier's red-rimmed eyes. You told him, he said, not question. Xavier nodded, stepping inside. He hates me. And I don't blame him. Adrian pulled him into a hug, his arms strong and steady. But Xavier pushed him away. Why didn't you stop this? He demanded, his voice shaking. You knew what this would do to him. To us. Adrian's face was a mask of regret, but his voice was firm. Because I'm tired of hiding who I am, he said. I spent 20 years married to a woman I didn't love, pretending for Caleb's sake, for my family's sake. I can't do it anymore. Xavier. Not with you. Xavier's chest ached, torn between anger and the pull of Adrian's words. So what now, he asked. We just keep going? Pretend Caleb doesn't matter. No, Adrian said, his voice soft. We figure out how to make this right. For all of us. But Xavier wasn't sure that was possible. As he left Adrian's house, the city felt colder, emptier. He'd lost his best friend, and the man he was falling for might not be worth the cost. Weeks passed, and the silence from Caleb was a wound that wouldn't heal. Xavier threw himself into his studies, his part-time job at a graphic design studio. Anything to keep his mind off the mess he'd made. But Adrian was a constant presence, texting, calling, showing up at Xavier's apartment with coffee and apologies that felt too heavy to carry. I miss you, Adrian said one evening, standing in Xavier's cramped living room, his hands shoved into his pockets. I know this is hard, but I'm not giving up on us. Xavier wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the comfort of his arms. But the ghost of Caleb's betrayal lingered. I need time, he said, echoing his words from weeks ago. I need to make things right with Caleb first. Adrian nodded, his face tight with understanding. I'll wait, he said. As long as it takes. Xavier spent days drafting a letter to Caleb, pouring his heart onto the page, his guilt, his love for Adrian, his hope that they could rebuild what was broken. He left it in Caleb's mailbox. No expectation of a response, just a need to be honest. Days later, Caleb texted, "Meet me at the park." Noon. Xavier arrived early, his nerves frayed. The bay a gray expanse under a cloudy sky. Caleb was already there, sitting on a bench, his expression unreadable. "I read your letter," he said as Xavier approached, his voice flat. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" Xavier swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, I am." Caleb looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't get it," he said. "He's my dad. He's supposed to be, I don't know, untouchable. But I saw how he looked at you, even before all this. I should have known. I'm sorry," Xavier said, the words feeling small against the weight of Caleb's pain. "I never wanted to hurt you." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "I know. And I hate that I can't hate you forever. You're still my best friend. Zav. Even if this sucks, it wasn't forgiveness. Not fully, but it was a start." They talked for hours, the conversation raw and halting, rebuilding trust one word at a time. Caleb didn't embrace Adrian's relationship with Xavier, but he didn't shut the door either. It was enough for now. Months later, Xavier stood on Adrian's rooftop terrace. The city spread out before them, the Golden Gate Bridge a faint outline in the distance. Adrian's arms wrapped around him from behind, his chin resting on Xavier's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice warm against Xavier's ear. Xavier leaned into him, the weight of the past months lifting slightly. "Getting there," he said. "Caleb's talking to me again. He even invited me to his birthday next week." Adrian smiled, pressing a kiss to Xavier's temple. That's progress. It was more than progress. It was a new beginning. Xavier had learned that love wasn't just about desire. It was about honesty, sacrifice, and the courage to face the consequences. He and Adrian weren't perfect, and their relationship would always carry the scars of its beginning. But they were building something real, something worth fighting for. As the sun set over the bay, casting the city in hues of gold and pink, Xavier felt a quiet hope settle in his chest. He'd lost pieces of himself along the way, but he'd gained something too, a love that demanded everything and gave even more in return. And in the end, that was enough.